The year is 1997. A Boeing 747 wanted to land at Chennai airport, but the pilots somehow managed to miss the entire Chennai airfield and went and landed at an Air Force airport pretty close by. And today I'm going to be telling you how this very amazing and very interesting thing happened in Cockpit Stories episode 6. What's up everyone, Tapesh Kumar here, and I hope all of you are staying home, all of you are safe. And just to make your quarantine a little bit more interesting, this is another episode of Cockpit Stories. I hope you enjoy. Starts when a 747 belonging to Saudi Arabian Airlines was approaching Chennai on a very nice and calm evening of 1997. The weather was absolutely fine, everything was perfect for the approach. So the pilots requested for a visual approach, and when they shot the visual approach, instead of seeing Chennai airport, they ended up seeing Tambaram airfield. Now Tambaram is an Air Force airfield which is pretty close to Chennai, and the runways at Chennai and Tambaram are pretty much identical in the sense they both faced in the same direction. The 747 pilots, instead of seeing Chennai runway, ended up seeing Tambaram runway, and they thought that was Chennai, and they ended up making an approach for the Air Force airfield. Before we continue, just a small request: if you guys are new here, please do subscribe to the channel. We're getting to 100k very soon, and also it gives me the motivation to continue bringing you guys some really good aviation content. Also, if you want to find me on Instagram, have a chit chat with me, feel free. My link is in the description, or you can just search for Tapshi in Instagram. Thank you! Before I tell you the complete story of this very hilarious incident which costed Saudi Arabian Airlines quite a bit, let me first tell you that this is not the first time this has ever happened. It has been happening a lot of times wherein pilots wanting to land at one airport somehow end up landing at another airport which is pretty close by. For example, in 1993, Jet Airways itself, on their inaugural flight to Coimbatore, instead of landing at Coimbatore airport, landed at Sulur Air Force Station. Back in 1972, a Japan Airlines DC-8, instead of landing at Mumbai CSIA, which is the main airport in Mumbai, it landed at Juhu Airport, which is like literally next to Mumbai Airport. And the unfortunate thing is that this particular aircraft overshot the runway because Juhu is a very short runway. So they ended up overshooting the runway and the aircraft was written off. So if you think these incidents only used to happen back in the 1900s and recently aisa kuch nahi hua ho, so let me tell you, in 2013, a modified Boeing 747 which is called the Dream Lifter. It's a big modified 747 which carries airplane parts all around the world. This particular aircraft, carrying some 787 parts, was supposed to land at McConnell Airfield in Kansas City. But instead of landing at the Air Force Station, it ended up landing at a small airfield also in Kansas City, pretty close to the one it was supposed to land at. So this was not the first time that a big aircraft had landed at an airfield it was not supposed to land at. But there was a catch here. Tambaram as a runway is very short. It's only 4,500 feet. A 747 is a huge aircraft, and it requires way more than 4,500 feet to land as well as take off normally. So how in this world did this 747 manage to land first of all? And if it landed, how did it manage to take off again and go back to Chennai? So the story goes something like this. बात है शाम के टाइम की. It was almost getting dark. This particular 747 belonged to Saudi Arabian Airlines, and on its approach into Chennai, the weather was absolutely fine, the visibility was great. So what the pilots did was they requested for a visual approach. Now visual approach is something in which you don't use any instruments or any landing aids to land at a runway. So the pilots basically look outside of their cockpit windows, they physically see the runway, and then they land the aircraft on the runway. Now the critical thing with this is you must see the correct runway to land. Now the other very critical thing which happened that day was the radar at Chennai airfield was not working. As a result, the air traffic controllers could not see where the 747 was going and which runway it was making an approach for. Now, as luck would have it, when the aircraft was cleared for the visual approach and the pilots looked outside their cockpit window, they ended up seeing Tambaram runway instead of Chennai runway. Now for someone like me who flies in India and who keeps on going to Chennai, I know how the runway looks like in Chennai, and if I'm making an approach for a wrong runway, I would automatically know it because I'm familiar with the airfield. But these pilots were unfortunately unfamiliar with Chennai. They had no idea how Chennai runway looked like, and that made a nice recipe for disaster. So now the ATC controller thought the aircraft was making an approach for the Chennai runway, which is runway 07. That's a 10,000 feet long runway. But instead the aircraft was making an approach for runway 05 at Tambaram, which is a 4,500 feet long runway. Because it was evening time, the Air Force station was closed. There was no Air Force flying happening at Tambaram airfield. But the ATC controller was still there in the ATC and his radar was working. So this ATC controller, he sees a big 747 is making an approach for his runway. So he called up the Chennai ATC guy and he was like, your aircraft is making an approach for my runway, what's happening? The Chennai controller tried to contact the Saudi Arabian aircraft but was unable to contact him. So the ATC controller now asked people who were down close to the runway at Tambaram to fire red colored flares in the air. For all of you who are pilots, I'm sure you would know, red colored flares fired in the air indicate to a landing aircraft that landing permission is not granted. 4 flares were fired. However, the 747 pilots either did not see the flares or they ignored them, no one knows, but they continued the approach and they landed at Tambaram airfield. Now, as soon as they landed, the pilots realized their huge mistake. But thankfully, they had the presence of mind to just jam on the brakes and do everything they could to stop the aircraft. Because they could see in front of them the runway was running out and the end of the runway was coming close. With fully jammed brakes, the aircraft ended up blowing 4 tires because the brakes heated up so much, but they still managed to stop on the runway with 100 meters of the runway to spare. But as soon as the aircraft landed, the whole of the Air Force station was woken up, and not by the sound of the aircraft but by the emergency situation which was created by a huge passenger jet landing at a very short runway without any permissions, without any landing clearance and without any emergency. That is a very big deal. So as soon as the aircraft stopped, it was cordoned off, surrounded by the Air Force, and all of their weapons locked and loaded pointed at the aircraft. The 330 passengers on board had no clue what was happening and they had no idea how close they had come to dying. The passengers were kept on board for 5 hours while Air Force, DGCA, Civil Aviation Ministry, everyone was informed. Meetings were called, phone calls were made, and finally sabotage was ruled out and it was realized that the mistake was an honest one, wherein the pilots saw the wrong runway and they just landed on the runway. So once it was established that the aircraft had landed at the wrong airport because of just pure human error, now the next big problem was how to get the aircraft out of that tiny runway. The aircraft was stuck in Tambaram for 4 days, wherein a lot of meetings were called, people from Saudi Arabian Airlines also came in, and discussions went on how to get the aircraft out. Some people suggested that the aircraft be broken down and the parts be individually carried to Chennai airport. Some people suggested the aircraft be scrapped and be forever kept at Tambaram, or maybe just sold off somewhere. But another idea was to fly the aircraft out of Tambaram after stripping it down completely, and that is exactly what was finalized on. The aircraft was completely stripped out, and when I say completely, it means everything unnecessary was taken out. The seats were removed, even the air conditioning on the aircraft was removed. The fuel on the aircraft was just enough for it to fly from Tambaram to Chennai, which is like literally right next to Chennai. All of this was being done to make the aircraft as light as possible. A light aircraft always requires a shorter runway to take off as compared to a heavier one. Now with everything removed, a very senior pilot from Saudi Arabian Airlines, the senior most instructor on the 747, was called in to fly the aircraft out. So on the fateful day, they had to wait for 3.5 hours for the winds to become favorable for the aircraft to take off. Because I'm sure, as all of you know, aircraft performance is better when we take off into the wind. So they had to wait for 3.5 hours just for the winds to change and be suitable enough for this aircraft to take off from the very short runway. And take off they did. Historically, this was the shortest airfield from which a 747 ever took off. The aircraft took 3,960 feet of the runway to get airborne. To give you a comparison, normally a 747 takes about 8,000 to 9,000 feet of runway to get airborne. This one took just about 4,000 feet. After exactly 9 minutes, the aircraft landed into Chennai and everything was fine. But not for Saudi Arabian Airlines. Once the aircraft had departed, it departed with a bill of 1.16 million riyals, which was given by the Indian Air Force to Saudi Arabian Airlines as runway usage and parking charges for the 4 days the aircraft was at Tambaram airfield. 1.16 million riyals is approximately about 1.5 crore rupees. So that one tiny mistake of seeing the wrong runway, which could have ended much worse, only ended with an emptied out 747 and a bill of about 1.5 crore rupees. So that was the story of a 747 which ended up landing at a wrong runway and just somehow managing to take off as well. I hope you guys enjoyed the story. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel if you're new here. It really helps me out. Let's just get to 100k super duper soon. Also, I hope all of you are staying home, all of you are staying safe. Please take precautions and stay away from Corona. This is your boy Tapesh Kumar signing off. I'll see you guys in the next one.